I'd like to thank JD for putting on this event and giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today. In order to tell you about my own farewell story, I have to tell you what it was like before. I'm your typical American-born Chinese. My parents and my older sister came over to the US, and boom, I was born. I always occupied a special place in my family. I was the first child to be born on both my mom and dad's side in the US. Everyone joked about how I would be the next president of the United States and how American I was. My grandparents, my laoye and laoye, came over to the States to look after me for a little bit, but after they left, my family was pretty nuclear after that. Resembled many families in our predominantly white neighborhood, except that we were Chinese. I had a paradoxical relationship with being Chinese. I railed against my parents' taste in cheesy pop music, their ability to watch Chinese drama series for hours on end, and that line as old as time, "We are different." I didn't feel all that different from my peers. I spoke English fluently. I watched PBS and Disney cartoons, had a major crush on Keira Knightley and Orlando Bloom in Pirates of the Caribbean, and religiously liked whatever my sister was into, which turned out to be soundtrack music, Harry Potter, and hating the Twilight franchise. Like any good Chinese kid, I got good grades, I played the violin, yada yada, and I'm also a little bit bilingual. I even know a little bit of my mom's Jiangsu dialect, which is notoriously hard to understand, and I learned from her speaking on the phone with her sisters, my Yi and Yima. It wasn't until 2005 that I met all my extended family for the first time. I was 6 and so shy and overwhelmed by all the familial obligations I was expected to fulfill. Who are all these strangers and how much should I emotionally invest in all of them? When I went through all the questions in my head, hard truths came out. I didn't know them, I didn't think about them, and I didn't love them, at least not in the way I loved my immediate family. Nevertheless, I was curious about them. Who were they? What did they go through? The juicy details. Turns out my parents and their siblings grew up during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which means my grandparents went through Japanese occupation, World War II, and the Chinese Civil War, all during their formative years. So I guess that's kind of badass. I got a little closer to my extended family when cousins from my mom's side came to the US to pursue higher education. And in high school, I began playing guzheng, a traditional Chinese instrument that's like a giant horizontal harp, if you will. And because Chinese traditional music smacks beyond belief, I joined a local Chinese music ensemble. But everything came to a head when I was 16. The summer of 2015, I went back to China where I hadn't been since 2012. After a few big days in the big cities of Nanjing and Shanghai, it was time to go back to where my mom had grown up. As we arrived in Dianduo, the very small town where my eldest aunt, uncle, and my grandparents grew up, I expressed concern for my Lala, my grandmother, who had Alzheimer's and had a live-in nurse taking care of her. My dad leaned over to me and said in English so that my relatives wouldn't understand, "Your grandpa, your laoye, is a little worse off than your grandma." I took this to mean that laoye was terminally ill, sick in a hospital bed somewhere. It would be hard to see him, but at least I would be able to say goodbye. The next day, we headed to the next town over where my grandparents had raised all their children. I thought we would be going to the house, tidying it up, and then going to see laoye in the hospital afterwards. As I walked into the main room, I saw my laoye's picture on the large table next to the incense burner. Then I asked my mom where he was. "Where?" she said. "Do you mean his tomb?" And that's how I found out laoye died, 2 years after the fact. I immediately broke into hysterical sobs. "Don't cry," everyone told me. "It's over now." But it wasn't over for me. Laoye had just died in my mind while everyone else had 2 years to process their grief. My mind scrambled for a timeline. 2 years before then, I had graduated 8th grade. I was getting ready for high school. I started playing guzheng, the very thing that was supposed to tie me closer to my heritage. That was when he died. What was actually happening in my family was much more chaotic. My eldest aunt and uncle couldn't figure out why laoye was so sickly. They went through many failed treatments, and when they finally did a colonoscopy, it was discovered that the colon cancer had advanced to a stage where it was impossible to do anything. My mother flew back in the summer of 2013 to see him one last time. I just thought it was an impromptu trip. No suspicions aroused. After the initial shock wore off, it didn't matter that no one told me. I should have known. I should have realized something was off when I didn't talk to laoye for 2 years. I should have seen the sadness in my family when he passed. But I didn't. I didn't really know him. I didn't think about him. What did that say about my love for him? The hardest thing for me was that everyone expected me to get over it quickly. In some ways I didn't, but in other ways I did. So we never really talked about it. I never really talked about it. But what did that say about me? In order to be a good Chinese granddaughter, did I have to feel guilty about the whole ordeal? If I get over his death and all that came with it, am I dishonoring his memory somehow? We weren't that close. And the only way I knew how to memorialize him was to agonize over my ignorance of his death. I clung to the hurt and anger, partly because I hadn't unpacked everything I needed to with myself or my family, but also because it was the only way I knew how to remember how much he meant to me. Whenever I thought about what laoye would have wanted me to do, he probably didn't want me to dwell over his death and hating my parents for not telling me. Rather, I should be celebrating his life and everything he did to make sure his family had a better life than he did. And I should forgive my parents, who were trying to protect me, and they really regret not telling me earlier. I wish back then to my small 16-year-old self that my grief was valid, but that there was a better way forward. It wasn't until this past summer that a very important movie came out when I finally felt like I could move on. Lulu Wang's The Farewell is phenomenal for so many reasons, but for me, it was the first time my story was told on the big screen, even if it was in a little way. This film explores how Chinese and Chinese Americans process their grief and how my generation communicates with their parents. Billy, the main character, has to keep the fact that her grandmother has cancer from her grandmother. And in her backstory, it's revealed that Billy's parents also did not tell her when her grandfather got sick and passed away. In that moment, sobbing and snot flowing out of my nose in the movie theater, I realized that I was not alone. Someone, somewhere else felt this. I do love my laoye, and he does matter to me, regardless of how much or how little I knew him. There will always be that cultural and generational gap between immigrant parents and their children, but that doesn't mean we can't know our own family. My parents and I see this opportunity as a way to reconcile our different worldviews and ways of thinking. And I would be lying if I said I don't feel any lingering shame over what happened. But I'm not at the end of the tunnel. There's more work to be done, more path to be tread. That's part of why I study history at school, because history is a way of ingraining the past in my life to try to understand across the great divide of time. For those of us who can't know family, whether it's through distance or because that they're not here anymore, it's even more important for us to share, to talk, and to remember. I encourage all of you to unpack the past, even when it is more traumatic and painful than what I have shared today. Working through tragedies doesn't make them worse or happen again in some weird sense, but rather it helps pave a way forward to grow and to heal. Thank you.